Spoiler warning for Dune Part 2. In this video, I reveal some of the later elements within this somewhat recently released film. So if you have not seen Dune Part 2 yet and wish to remain unspoiled, then you should probably skip this video for now. You can always come back to it later when you are ready, I promise. Dune Part 2 released to critical acclaim and major box office success a few months ago, and it did so for good reason. It's overall a fantastic science fiction film, and one that is visually beautiful and stylistically distinct in a way that reflects well on its creatively inspired director, Denis Villeneuve. No relation. In fact, this outer space epic is one of those movies that is just better in a theater, transporting the viewer into this movie's science fiction world and conflict through frame-worthy images, ear-rattling sounds of explosions in the action sequences, and just sweeping the audience away into the world of Frank Herbert's science fiction classic, which has remained among the most important science fiction novels since its release way back in 1965. Truly a book that has stood the test of time to the point that it has a legacy of greatness that even non-readers like myself can respect. And from what I understand, the movies Dune Part 1 and Dune Part 2, adapting the front half and the back half of that book respectively, reflect the source material fairly well. After all, the book and the movies are a larger-than-life space epic about how noble-born Paul Atreides, because space monarchy, witnesses the fall of his noble house and the death of his father on the desert planet of Arrakis. And that's desert planet, not desert planet, which would be f***ing weird. The reason for the Atreides family for being on that planet was due to how Arrakis is the only location for a valuable resource labeled spice. No relation. And the Emperor had entrusted House Atreides to mine for that said spice. But of course, House Atreides was betrayed by the Emperor, who essentially sent the Harkonnens, a rival house to the Atreides, to kill them, essentially butchering Atreides' forces, including Paul's father, Duke Leto. Because Oscar Isaac, no! And for that, Paul and his mother, Lady Jessica, no relation, survive the Harkonnen onslaught and meet with the Fremen, who are essentially indigenous to the planet of Arrakis and are resilient people who are fierce warriors, know how to survive in the harsh elements of this desert planet, both in terms of the near uninhabitable climate and the hostile wildlife, and even know how to ride giant sandworms. Because cars, when it comes to transportation, worms are the goddamn future. The Fremen are just an incredible people, and one that admittedly isn't all that interested in aiding House Atreides at the start, or well, at least at the end of Dune Part 1 and the beginning of Dune Part 2, respectively. Because, you know, Paul and Lady Jessica are seen as outsiders who are unfamiliar to Fremen customs. But over the course of Dune Part 2, Paul does try to prove its worth and be seen as a worthy warrior in the eyes of the Fremen. And admittedly, from there, you might be kind of predicting Dune Part 2's narrative momentum and Paul's character arc. After all, the hero's journey, as well as the idea of an outsider gaining trust of a community of which it is actually difficult to gain that said trust, is so damn common in Western fiction, fantasy, science fiction, or otherwise, as well as other types of epic storytelling. The type of storytelling that Paul could potentially reflect by heroically proving his worth to the Fremen and then ultimately becoming their leader as they join forces to defeat a dastardly enemy force, all while Paul is portrayed in a flattering heroic light, as he righteously vanquishes the whiter than plain mayonnaise Harkonnens, deposes the corrupt Emperor, no relation, takes the crown for himself, and leads the Fremen into further glory. And to a certain extent, a lot of those things do happen. Paul does prove his worth as a warrior, learns the ways of the Fremen, becomes the Fremen's de facto leader, eliminates the Harkonnen assholes, dethrones the Emperor, and essentially becomes the Fremen people's new hope. In a certain way, Dune Part 2 sees Paul fulfill some of those narrative expectations. But with that said, there is a key difference. What actually occurs is that Paul's journey from being a foreign outsider to the Fremen's messiah figurehead is overall in the film not portrayed in a noble or heroic light. If anything, a lot of Paul's character development and narrative progression is presented in a downright villainous context. It's portrayed in a horrific light, like Aaron Rodgers revealing his new favorite conspiracy theory of the moment on the internet, meaning that Paul's ascent to power and becoming the Fremen's savior actually isn't overall that good of a thing. And to be fair, this isn't news to anyone who has read the book or people like me who haven't read the source material but are aware of its impact on literature, science fiction, and pop culture. After all, Dune is nearly 60 years old and has been analyzed to death, where we can confidently say that even though Paul Atreides has some qualities that are inherent to being a hero, this young man is not heroic at all. Hell, he isn't even an anti-hero by my estimation. He's no Crow, or the equivalent of a romance between a man and his space goo as represented by Venom. No, Paul's not a good guy, even if those he faces like the Harkonnens, the Emperor, Emperor and the mystical all-women's club, the Bene Gesserit, now I just really want a beignet, y'all, are antagonistic and even morally worse in many areas, because even when compared to them, Paul is still just kind of shit. And that's been clear ever since media critics have analyzed Dune, the book, over the last 60 years, and have argued against non-media savvy folks who unapologetically view Paul Atreides and his actions in an altruistic light, despite the critical evidence in that he is not someone that should be hero worshipped. He is not a good guy, very much unlike Jake from State Farm. And now with the movies and Dune Part 1 and more importantly Dune Part 2, this discourse is roaring back again due to how there is an all-new audience interacting with this story for the first time, people that are unaware of what Paul is supposed to represent. And for that reason, it's worth going over how Paul Atreides is portrayed, haha, in these movies, mostly because a lot of movie and TV audiences have problems when it comes to hero worshipping the absolute worst people. Hell, I was even guilty of this back in my early 20s watching Breaking Bad, because, you know, Walter White is a god-awful person, yet I thought he was awesome at the time, to the point that I originally criticized the 5th season for not having a big bad antagonist like Giancarlo Esposito's Gus Fring, who was present in the middle seasons of the show, without realizing that Walter White was the antagonist, because wow, I was really dumb. And for that, I think it's kind of important to document the ways in which Paul Atreides is clearly not a hero in the modern Dune film adaptations. It's worth doing for all those who are only familiar with the story through the films and not the books and decades worth of discourse. Paul Atreides is bad for many reasons, but the most fundamental way to understand why this kid is often morally wrong is by understanding that Dune Part 2 is an overall critique on the white savior narrative. The idea that a privileged, generally white outsider ingratiates himself into a foreign culture, one that may even live in a land that is exploited by imperialistic assholes for resources, which, subtle, that predominantly consists of people of color, and a religious creed that differs from the one of that earlier mentioned white person, vis-a-vis Paul Atreides and the way he joins Fremen society. A Fremen who were indigenous folks of Arrakis were essentially Muslim and Arab coded in terms of dress, the ways in which they pray, and how they live in a desert. As I said, coded. And while yes, there was a criticism against Dune Part 2 and how many of the Fremen are played by folks who are not of Islamic heritage or Middle Eastern descent, which is a problem considering how heavily coded the Fremen are to real-life Muslim and Middle Eastern folks, the point still does get across thematically. Paul is a personal, racial, and cultural outsider compared to the Fremen, and he must eventually find a way to lead them, fight against the Harkonnens, and win over the heart of Zendaya's Chani. If anything, Paul must become their desert warrior Jesus. And Paul overall does this in a way that is morally murky. See, there was a faction of the Fremen who were religious fundamentalists, very much represented by the character of Stilgar, because Nisa al-Gaib meme, because Paul could wipe his ass back to front and Stilgar would believe that it was a sign that Paul is the Fremen messiah, who slowly but surely believe that Paul is the prophesized chosen one. And for a lot of the movie, Lady Jessica, after drinking blue worm blood ecto-cooler that changes her as a person, manipulates these fundamentalists into believing that Paul is their messiah by forcing the elements of their chosen one prophecy to be fulfilled, twisting the prophecy to her own ends and seeing him fulfill prophesized elements that may look miraculous to the Fremen, but are logistically possible due to how Paul was born via a long line of eugenics and thus has a natural predisposition to accomplish the miraculous, because those Bene Gesserits, am I right? And Lady Jessica knows this, which is why she is unafraid of pushing Paul to the mental and physical edge in order to manipulate the Fremen via having Paul fulfill the prophecy, which is kind of gauche of her. Furthermore, Paul has visions of future disaster, ones where he moves to southern Arrakis to consolidate followers that would lead to a war causing the deaths of countless millions and maybe even billions of people throughout the galaxy, including Zendaya, who would be Zendying, a true atrocity within the annals of space human history that is only matched by the existence of Anthem, because that game. And to his credit, Paul is initially reluctant to embark on that journey that would result in such a catastrophic loss of human life. He doesn't want to use the Fremen in that way and be the root cause of mass death. Paul just refuses, even to the point of becoming more distant towards his manipulative mother. But as his conflict with the Harkonnens shifts in favor of those said Harkonnens, Paul's hand is forced. He moves south where the genocide ball gets a rolling. And admittedly, Paul traveling to southern Arrakis doesn't inherently mean that his outlook has to change. He doesn't doesn't have to stop being a caring leader just because of a change of Arrakis' geographical location. Hell, Paul doesn't have to lose his soul and heart just because he moves. Yet Paul does. Like his mother, Paul drinks the blue worm blood flavored Gatorade, and he sees the past and the future, which inspires him to give a rousing dictator-esque speech to his Fremen followers in order to consolidate power, and formulates a battle plan to defeat the Harkonnens and unseat Emperor Walken, essentially kickstarting events that would cause mass death throughout the galaxy, like a Death Star on steroids. And Paul eventually succeeds. The Harkonnens are killed, the Fremen are victorious, and the Emperor is unseated in favor of Paul. But this victory comes at a tremendous cost. Despite loving Chani and confessing how much he loves her right before the climax, Paul makes a strategic marriage proposal to the Emperor's daughter and Florence Pugh's Princess Irulan. The rest of the houses in the galaxy reject Paul's ascent to the throne, and the movie ends when Paul sends the Fremen into space to start a holy war against those aforementioned houses, thus kickstarting galaxy-wide genocide. Hooray. And the movie rightfully presents this as all morally wrong. After all, Chani leaving Paul at the end was more than just over her having a broken heart. If anything, she saw that Paul was essentially destroying her people and were transforming them into something else entirely, something that went against her moral code. And then there's the fact that Paul's deceased father, Duke Leto, would not have approved of Paul's methods of defeating the Harkonnens and unseating the Emperor towards the back half of Dune Part 2. In fact, the Emperor reveals that the reason he betrayed Paul's father, despite how Oscar Isaac is a national f***ing treasure, was all due to how he viewed Papa Atreides as a weak man who had too big of a heart. Something that is polarly opposite to Paul at the end of Dune Part 2, because whether it comes to breaking Chani's heart, destroying what the Fremen used to be, and starting a war that would lead to mass death, Paul has clearly lost his way. He has become corrupted. He lost the heart that Paul's father would have prized in his son. It's just not portrayed as a good thing. So to conclude, Paul Atreides is not a good guy. While he does grapple with a multitude of personal, moral, and ethical dilemmas, it's painfully obvious that by the end of the movie, Paul is less than heroic. He overall compromised his beliefs in order to achieve victory, alienating his love Chani, turning the Fremen into would-be conquerors, taking advantage of the Fremen for his own ends, and dooming the galaxy to a bloody war resulting in death beyond count. And for all of these reasons, Paul Atreides should not be put on the pedestal as a hero, because truly, Paul is a critique of the messianic chosen one figure, and thus should not be looked up to. Paul is just not worthy of hero worship.